What if I told you that thousands of German soldiers during World War II deliberately shot themselves in the foot, cut their own hands, or infected their wounds on purpose? What if I told you this was not cowardice, but a desperate act of survival that reveals one of the most disturbing aspects of Nazi Germany's war machine? Today, we are diving deep into one of the darkest chapters of military history, the phenomenon of self-inflicted wounds, or as the Germans called it, Selbstverstümmelung. This is not just a story about soldiers trying to escape battle. It is a story about what happens when an entire military system becomes so brutal, so inhumane, that men would rather mutilate themselves than continue serving. By the end of this video, you will understand why this desperate practice became so widespread that the German military had to create entire medical units just to detect and punish these soldiers. And you will learn about the shocking punishments that awaited those who were caught. But before we continue, if you find these deep historical investigations valuable, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the notification bell. Your support helps us continue bringing you these untold stories from history. Before we dive into the disturbing details, we need to understand the context. When most people think about German soldiers in World War II, they picture the early war propaganda images, disciplined, motivated troops marching through Europe. But by 1943, the reality was dramatically different. The German Wehrmacht was facing unprecedented challenges. The initial victories in Poland, France, and early operations in the Soviet Union had given way to brutal, prolonged warfare. The failed siege of Stalingrad, which ended in February 1943, marked a turning point. Over 200,000 German soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured in that single campaign. But it was not just military defeats that were breaking the German army. The Nazi regime's increasing demands for total commitment to the war effort meant that soldiers faced impossible choices. Leave was virtually eliminated. Medical standards for fitness were continuously lowered, meaning injured soldiers were sent back to the front lines before they had properly healed. Perhaps most importantly, by 1943, many German soldiers were beginning to understand the true nature of the war they were fighting. Reports of mass killings, the Holocaust, and other war crimes were filtering back through the ranks. Many soldiers found themselves complicit in activities that violated their personal moral codes. The psychological pressure was immense. These men were caught between their duty as soldiers, their personal survival instincts, and their growing awareness of the moral catastrophe unfolding around them. In this impossible situation, some chose a desperate path. They would wound themselves to escape the war. The methods, desperate acts of self-preservation. The practice of self-inflicted wounds was not new to warfare. It had occurred in World War I and other conflicts. But in Nazi Germany, it reached unprecedented levels. German military medical records, discovered after the war, reveal the shocking scope of this phenomenon. Dr. Heinrich Böning, a Wehrmacht medical officer, documented over 12,000 cases of suspected self-inflicted wounds in his sector alone between 1943 and 1945. But these were only the cases that were detected and officially recorded. The actual numbers were likely much higher. The methods soldiers used were as varied as they were desperate. The most common was shooting oneself in the foot or hand, typically with the soldier's own rifle. They would wrap the weapon in cloth to muffle the sound and fire through their boot or glove to make it appear like an enemy bullet. Others used more elaborate methods. Some soldiers would deliberately expose wounds to dirt and infection, causing them to become septic and require extended medical treatment. Others would break their own bones by placing their limbs under heavy equipment or in doorways. One of the most disturbing methods involved what soldiers called rat shots. They would capture rats, shoot them, and then rub the dead animals on their own wounds to cause severe infections. The logic was simple but horrifying. A badly infected wound would require weeks or months of hospital treatment, keeping them away from the front lines. But perhaps the most psychologically revealing method was what medical officers called accident staging. Soldiers would carefully plan scenarios to make their self-inflicted wounds appear accidental. They might accidentally discharge their weapon while cleaning it, or slip and fall on their own bayonet. The creativity and desperation behind these methods reveal just how unbearable military service had become for these men. They were willing to risk court-martial, imprisonment, and even execution rather than continue fighting. The response? A brutal system of detection and punishment. The German military high command was fully aware of this growing problem, and their response was characteristically brutal. In 1943, they established specialized medical units whose sole purpose was to identify and prosecute soldiers who had wounded themselves. These units were staffed with both medical experts and military police. They developed increasingly sophisticated methods to detect self-inflicted wounds. Forensic analysis became routine, examining bullet trajectories, powder burns, and wound patterns to determine whether injuries were genuine or self-inflicted. Dr. Ernst Rostock, who worked in one of these units, later testified that they became extraordinarily skilled at detecting deception. They would examine the angle of bullet wounds, the presence or absence of fabric fibers in the wound channel, and even the soldier's emotional reactions when being examined. The military also implemented what they called wound inspections, surprise medical examinations of soldiers who had been wounded multiple times. Soldiers who showed patterns of suspicious injuries faced immediate investigation, but the most chilling aspect of the military's response was the punishment system. Soldiers convicted of self-mutilation faced a range of penalties that escalated throughout the war. Early in the conflict, they might face imprisonment or transfer to punishment battalions, but by 1944, the penalty was increasingly death. The Nazi military justice system processed over 30,000 cases of suspected self-mutilation during the war. Of these, approximately 15,000 resulted in convictions. The exact number of executions is unknown, but historians estimate that several thousand German soldiers were shot by their own military for the crime of trying to escape the war. What makes this even more tragic is that many of the soldiers who chose self-mutilation were not cowards in any conventional sense. Military records show that many had exemplary service records, had been wounded multiple times in legitimate combat, and had shown considerable bravery under fire. They were simply human beings who had reached their psychological breaking point. To truly understand why soldiers resorted to self-mutilation, we need to examine the psychological conditions they faced. Modern military psychology recognizes what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, but in Nazi Germany, such concepts were dismissed as weakness or cowardice. The German military medical system had virtually no recognition of combat stress or psychological trauma. Soldiers suffering from what we would now recognize as severe PTSD were often accused of malingering or cowardice. The military solution was typically to send these men back to the front lines as quickly as possible. Dr. Wilhelm Hoffmann, a Wehrmacht psychiatrist, documented the psychological state of German soldiers in late 1944. His reports, discovered in Soviet archives after the war, paint a picture of an army in psychological collapse. Soldiers were experiencing what he called total emotional exhaustion, a state where the normal human responses to danger and stress had been completely overwhelmed. Many soldiers reported persistent nightmares, inability to sleep, and extreme anxiety. They described feeling disconnected from their own emotions and actions, as if they were watching themselves from outside their bodies. Some reported being unable to eat or experiencing violent trembling that they could not control, but perhaps most significantly, many soldiers described a complete loss of faith in their cause and their leadership. By 1944, it was becoming clear to frontline soldiers that Germany was losing the war. Yet the Nazi regime continued to demand total commitment and sacrifice. Even as the military situation became hopeless, the psychological pressure was compounded by the brutal discipline system within the German military. Officers were under orders to maintain discipline through increasingly harsh measures. Soldiers could be shot for retreating without orders, for showing insufficient enthusiasm, or even for expressing doubt about the war effort. In this environment, self-mutilation became, paradoxically, a rational choice. It was a way to escape an impossible situation while maintaining some semblance of honor. A soldier who wounded himself could claim he had been injured in combat, preserving his reputation and avoiding the stigma of desertion. The human stories, individual tragedies behind the statistics. The human stories behind these statistics are both tragic and illuminating. Let me share some specific cases that illustrate the desperation these soldiers faced. Hans Müller was a 22-year-old infantry private from Bavaria who had served on the Eastern Front for 18 months. His letters home, discovered by Allied forces, document his psychological deterioration. In early letters, he wrote enthusiastically about serving the fatherland, but by late 1943, his tone had changed completely. "I cannot describe the things I have seen," he wrote to his mother. "I cannot continue to be part of this madness." In December 1943, Müller shot himself in the left foot while on sentry duty. He claimed he had been targeted by a Soviet sniper, but medical examination revealed the wound was self-inflicted. He was court-martialed and executed in January 1944. Another case involved Sergeant Klaus Weber, a veteran who had served since the invasion of Poland in 1939. Weber had been wounded 3 times in legitimate combat and had received decorations for bravery. But by 1944, his mental state had deteriorated severely. His commanding officer noted that Weber had become increasingly withdrawn and had begun questioning orders. Weber chose a particularly elaborate method of self-mutilation. He deliberately exposed an existing wound to infection, then claimed the infection was spreading. Medical examination revealed that he had introduced foreign material into the wound to cause the infection. Weber was sentenced to serve in a punishment battalion, where he was killed in action 3 weeks later. Perhaps the most tragic case involved Friedrich Hoffmann, a 19-year-old conscript who had been drafted in late 1943. Hoffmann came from a religious family and had initially been exempt from military service due to his studies for the priesthood. When this exemption was revoked, he found himself thrust into the brutal reality of the Eastern Front. Hoffmann's diary, recovered after the war, reveals his psychological journey. "How can I reconcile my faith with what I am ordered to do?" he wrote. "How can I kill in God's name?" Hoffmann eventually chose to break his own arm with a rock, claiming he had fallen from a watchtower. His injury was poorly staged, and he was quickly identified as having self-mutilated. He was executed in March 1944. These cases illustrate a crucial point. These were not cowards or malingers in any traditional sense. They were ordinary men who had been placed in an extraordinary and impossible situation. Their choice to wound themselves was an act of desperation, not weakness. The legacy: lessons from a dark chapter. The phenomenon of self-inflicted wounds in the German military reveals something profound about the nature of the Nazi regime and its impact on ordinary Germans. It demonstrates how totalitarian systems can push individuals to desperate extremes by eliminating all other forms of resistance or escape. The Nazi regime had created a military system that was not just about winning battles, but about enforcing a particular ideology. Soldiers were expected to be not just warriors, but ideological believers. Those who questioned or doubted faced severe punishment, leaving self-mutilation as one of the few remaining forms of resistance. This also reveals the fundamental contradiction at the heart of Nazi military culture. The regime promoted an ideology of strength, honor, and sacrifice, yet its actual policies created conditions that drove soldiers to desperate and dishonorable acts. The system that claimed to be creating superior human beings was actually breaking down ordinary people, psychologically and morally. The military's response to self-mutilation, with its emphasis on detection, punishment, and execution, further demonstrates the inhumanity of the Nazi system. Rather than addressing the underlying causes of soldiers' desperation, the military chose to respond with increased brutality. This created a vicious cycle. The more brutal the punishment system became, the more desperate soldiers became, leading to even more extreme forms of self-mutilation. The phenomenon also highlights the human cost of Nazi ideology beyond the battlefield casualties we typically discuss. These were German soldiers, the regime's own people, being driven to mutilate themselves by the very system they were supposed to serve. It is a powerful illustration of how totalitarian ideologies ultimately consume their own supporters. Perhaps most importantly, these cases force us to confront difficult questions about resistance and complicity. Were these soldiers heroes for finding a way to resist participating in an immoral war? Were they victims of a brutal system? Or were they simply human beings trying to survive in impossible circumstances? The answer is probably all of these things simultaneously. The phenomenon of self-inflicted wounds reminds us that even in the most extreme circumstances, individual human beings retain some capacity for moral choice, even if that choice comes at a terrible personal cost. The legacy of this phenomenon extends far beyond the war itself. After Germany's surrender in 1945, the full scope of self-mutilation cases became apparent to Allied investigators. The documentation revealed not just the extent of the practice, but the systematic nature of the military's response. These records became important evidence in war crimes trials, not because self-mutilation was itself a war crime, but because they revealed the inhumane conditions within the German military. The fact that thousands of soldiers preferred to wound themselves rather than continue serving became evidence of the regime's fundamental brutality. For decades after the war, this aspect of German military history was largely ignored or suppressed. In both East and West Germany, there was little appetite for examining the psychological breakdown of German soldiers. The focus was on reconstruction and moving forward, not on confronting difficult truths about the war experience. It was not until the 1980s and 1990s that German historians began seriously studying this phenomenon. Their research revealed that the practice was far more widespread than previously known and that it represented a significant form of resistance to Nazi military culture. This research also contributed to our broader understanding of military psychology and the effects of extreme stress on soldiers. The German cases became part of the evidence base for recognizing and treating what we now call PTSD. They demonstrated that psychological breakdown under extreme stress is a normal human response, not a sign of weakness or cowardice. Today, the stories of these soldiers are being remembered in a different light. Rather than being seen as cowards or traitors, they are increasingly viewed as victims of an inhumane system who found the only form of resistance available to them. The phenomenon of self-inflicted wounds among German soldiers in World War II reveals some uncomfortable truths about human nature, military culture, and totalitarian systems. It shows us that when people are placed in impossible situations, they will find ways to resist, even if those ways seem desperate or self-destructive. These soldiers were not heroes in any conventional sense, but they were also not villains. They were ordinary human beings trapped in an extraordinary and inhumane system. Their choice to wound themselves was simultaneously an act of desperation and an act of resistance, a refusal to continue participating in something they found morally unbearable. Their stories remind us that even in the darkest chapters of human history, individual conscience and the basic human instinct for survival continue to assert themselves. They also remind us of the terrible human cost of ideological extremism and military brutality. Perhaps most importantly, these stories force us to confront difficult questions about moral responsibility and individual choice under extreme circumstances. They remind us that the line between victim and perpetrator, between resistance and complicity, is often more complex than we might prefer to believe. The thousands of German soldiers who wounded themselves in World War II left us with a disturbing but important legacy. They showed us what happens when military and political systems become so inhumane that self-mutilation becomes preferable to continued service. Their sacrifice, and make no mistake, it was a sacrifice, should serve as a warning about the ultimate consequences of unchecked militarism and ideological extremism. In remembering their stories, we honor not just their individual struggles, but the fundamental human capacity for moral choice, even in the darkest of circumstances.